Okay, hi. So I am finally recording a video to talk about all of my favorite books that I read in 2023. Okay, so I read 76 books in 2023. 7 of those were rereads, which won't be included on this list. So I read 69 new to me books. I read less books than usual because I normally break 100, but I actually read more pages than usual because I was reading a lot of big chunky fantasies. So that's going to be, spoilers. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is fantasy. Fantasy was 56% of my reading for the year. My next highest genre was contemporary, and it was 9%. So the other 44% of my reading was spread amongst a lot of different genres, and unfortunately most of those did not make it to the list. I kind of broke this out in like superlatives of favorites. So I want to start out with my favorite setting that I have discovered about myself. It's a little bit more specific than a setting, but it's nautical. So things that take place on a ship. I already knew I liked this. I have read We the Drowned, which is a multi-generational saga that mainly takes place on a ship that I really loved probably like 4 or 5 years ago. And I read a lot of books that take place on ships, and I'm talking about most of them in this video. So it's not just it's on a ship, but like if there's a quest, I'm like completely there for it. And I also love it in a fantasy setting, though I don't think it has to be a fantasy setting. So if you know of nautical fiction that has a quest component, definitely let me know because I am very interested in reading it. So we'll start, what do we want to start with? I'll just kind of go off of that. So I'm going to start with a second chance author. I attempted City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty multiple times. I DNF'd it once in 2021. I DNF'd it a second time this year in 2023. But I felt like there was so much potential in the writing that I decided to read The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi, and I'm very pleased that I did because I really enjoyed that book. So it is a nautical fantasy with a quest. You're following your protagonist, who is Amina Al-Sirafi. She is a woman in her 40s, and it has like that trope of like getting the band back together. She, very early on in the book, comes up against a conflict where she kind of has to go back to her past life of being, in a sense, a pirate queen. This setting is inspired by medieval travel on the Indian Ocean. It has a really rich setting that I really enjoyed reading. A lot of different people and cultures coming together in this setting, and you're following a lot of characters that are a little bit older. So I think a lot of fantasy, you're following younger characters. I thought this was really fun. I thought it was well plotted. I enjoyed the character work. I enjoyed the relationships that we were following. It had a fun plot. It had some fun fantasy elements, although it felt much more like historically embedded than being just a fantasy. And it had like a really great ending where you could feel completely satisfied reading this as a standalone, but it does have a trajectory where you could easily see where this could go on to be a series, which it is planned to be. So I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and I recommend it. Obviously, I recommend everything on this list. We'll just continue on with my nautical theme. So the next one I want to talk about is like hooked on an author. So the last time I did a superlative like this was in 2021, and it was Sarah Waters. And I actually completed all of the Sarah Waters books this year, although none of them made it to my favorites list. So the author I read the most unique works from, as in it not in the same series this year, was Brandon Sanderson. It was from, if you're into fantasy, you definitely know that it was the year of Sanderson. He came out with his 4 secret novels. I read 3 of those during the year, and I read the entirety of Mistborn Era 2 during the year as well. So Judging from the theme, it will not be shocking at all that the book that is making this list is Tress of the Emerald Sea, because it takes place, like I said, on a ship, and it is a quest. So this world is really fun. It is a very whimsical book. It's told from like a character perspective who is within the context of the book. Like, he is a character in the book, but he's not narrating from the context of being involved. It's more of like an omniscient narrator. So one of my favorite parts of this novel, aside from the fact that it takes place on a ship, is that it takes place in a really interesting world where the seas are made of spores. And there are multiple seas, and they're all different colored spores, and they pose different challenges when you're attempting to cross them. So the concept of non-water oceans really adds a lot of fun elements to the story and hurdles that the characters have to cross. So this is about Tress, who is a younger protagonist who is from like a lower class of society on the island that she lives on, but she has befriended the prince character, and he goes missing, and she goes on a quest to find him. And it's very whimsical and fun, and my favorite of the 3 Year of Sandersons that I read. It is a standalone novel. It is fantasy. It has a fun quest, super whimsical. Overall, I just really enjoyed it. Okay, so the next category I want to talk about is a book that has a lot of hype around it that I think deserves the hype. So I really had 2 books that fell into this category for me that were like vying for this spot. One of them I read very early on in the year, which is Babel by RF Kuang, and one of them I read very late in the year in December, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. So these are both very hyped authors, and I've read books before this by both of them, and these are both fantasy books that take place on Earth in our setting and have like fantasy vibes. Like, there's just fantasy in this world now. So I was surprised by how much I liked The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. And I had a feeling I was going to really love Babel, and I did. And for me, Babel kind of wins this one out a little bit because of the concepts behind the book. Babel takes place in Oxford in the 1700s, and you're following a cast of BIPOC characters who end up in studying at the Academy of Language. One of my favorite parts about this book is the incorporation of fantasy into the historic setting. So in this world, it's just like ours, except for the use of silver and the use of language. So essentially, when you translate anything, there's meaning that exists between the translations. There are words that cannot be completely translated. And the concept of this world is that the space between a translation can be harnessed and used as energy to make objects work a certain way. And so you're in a dark academia setting where you, for a lot of the first half of the book, get to sit in the classrooms, and it's a lot of philosophical ideas around language and the use of language and how you translate. You're following 4 main characters. 3 of them are BIPOC characters, and 1 of them is a white woman. And they are all kind of accepted into Oxford because of their ability to translate from languages that for Oxford and for the Western world are a bit more obscure. The first half of the book is a lot of philosophizing, a lot of sitting in a classroom, a lot of painting the world that they are living within, and then it kind of takes a separate turn at a certain point where it becomes a little bit more plot heavy. I loved the first half of this book so much. I wasn't as big of a fan of the change in when the plot kicked off and kind of you had a lot more forward momentum to the book. I enjoyed it a little bit less, but also just really interesting themes around colonialism. They're very much on the page. A lot of critique of colonialism, colorism, overall, of all the RF Kuang books I've read, it's definitely my favorite. Okay, let's talk about the only non-fantasy on this list. And this is going to be my surprise. So I picked this book up on a whim because I thought the cover was interesting, and that is Maeve Fly by CJ Leede. This is a debut, and it is a horror novel that, as you can tell, I'm a sucker for settings. So it takes place in Los Angeles, where I lived for 4 years while I was getting my degree, and you follow a protagonist who is loves the seedier elements of LA, the dirtiness, and describes like a seedy, dirty environment in a way where they find it very pleasing, so it comes off as extremely satirical. It is definitely a satirical horror novel where you're following your protagonist, who is a younger woman who, when you meet her, she's working as a Disney princess, but you don't call it Disney. And then you slowly watch her devolve into murder, essentially. And I said, it's very satirical, over the top, it's disgusting and gory. She's doing things that she obviously could never get away with. There's no way that what happened in this book could actually happen. But it kept me really intrigued. She has interesting relationships with the people around her, including her grandmother, her dying grandmother, who she really looks up to. And then a man gets involved in her life. And it's just kind of one of those horror novels where it's kind of how far can you take it in a way where it's very American Psycho inspired. But I liked it a little bit more. Well, actually, I liked it a lot more. I didn't really like American Psycho at all. That book was disgusting. But anyway, yeah, only non-fantasy to make it onto this list. Then I'm going to talk about my favorite series. So I read a lot of series this year. I finished the Shattered Sand series by Bradley P. Ballou, which went on to my most disappointing of the year list. I completed from start to finish Mistborn Era 2 by Brandon Sanderson. I read the entirety of The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. And then I read 4 of the 5 series within the realm of the Elderling. So I read the Live Ship Trader series, the Tawny Man trilogy, the Rainwild Chronicles, and the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. And my favorite series that I read this year is the realm of the Elderling. So I'm counting the entirety of it, although I read the first trilogy in 2022. I have never had this level of commitment to a series. This is the longest one I've ever read. So in total, the entirety of the series is 16 books, and I did also read 1 novella in the series as well. For me, Rob and Hobb can do no wrong, and I think that the realm of the Elderling is probably my favorite series I've ever read. And if I had to pick a favorite within the series, of the 5 series within the realm of the Elderling, my favorites are probably the Live Ship Trader series and Tawny Man, the second Fitz series. Robin Hobb just can write a sentence. She can make you feel so much by saying very little. Her writing is descriptive, but not purple. She can write characters. She can write character relationships. She can write extremely consistent characters who stay very consistent throughout their lives, which I think is a hard thing to achieve because people change, but they are inherently still the same person. She can write really interesting magic systems. The way that magic systems come together between the worlds is really fascinating. She's really good at creating intrigue that I think one thing that a lot of writers are challenged in is how much information to give you, where you can figure some things out, but there's still mystery. It's not directly on the page. I think she does a really good job of that. I think that her thematic work is really interesting. The way that she connects concepts between the series and also the types of things that she really looks at through her characters, like generational trauma and loyalty. There are a lot of themes of identity, your identity to yourself and your identity in relation to the people around you within all of the series. There is, even though the series are not fast-paced, there's a lot of drama between the characters. You have very dramatic characters. Fitz himself is an extremely dramatic character. And then throughout this series, you get introduced to a lot of interesting characters as you go. So the scope of the people you know continues broadening. And with all of them comes a lot of interest for me. There were, of course, with everything, a few gripes that I had with the series. I think that some of the books have pacing issues, mainly the Fitz ones, I would say. But they're not books that you read because you want a really fast-paced plot. It's much more of interest in the characters and living their life with them. I think my biggest negative in this series has to do with the queerness in the culture. It is extremely frowned upon to be gay, and I don't feel like it's used in the series, but I don't feel like it ever has a significant purpose. And I think that it could have been a queer accepting culture and you would have gotten to the same position. And there's actually magics in the world that are highly frowned upon that are treated, I think, by characters in the same way that queer identity is in history and in present places in the world now. So thematically, you could have had that conversation of lack of acceptance of people as for who they are through the magic systems, instead of also introducing homophobia into most of the cultures. But that's my main con for the series, which it didn't make me hate the series by any means. It's just something I noticed once I finished the series where I still felt like it didn't really have much of a value. But all to say, it's my favorite series I've read of all time, so not a big enough con for me to dislike it. I am currently rereading the first trilogy, the Farseer trilogy. I did the whole read with Mariana at Mariana Moss Books. And this is just one of those series that is quite the commitment to do a buddy read to, because it's so many books and they're each very long. But the experience was just wonderful. There's so many mysterious things happening that we were trying to suss out together as we were reading. There's so many different thematic things. There's so many themes and elements of the story to talk about. It just makes for such a rich buddy reading experience, and buddy reading it really did, I think, make me enjoy the books more, because I spent more time outside of the reading itself considering and thinking about the book, and just made the experience a lot deeper. So I love that series for the reading, for the actual books themselves, and then for the reading experience. And then that's kind of going to loop into the last thing I want to talk about, which is my favorite character that I read. I am normally not a character reader, and that isn't to say I don't like character-driven books, because I really do. Those, I think, are my favorite books. I love, at this point in my reading life, I love really rich, deep characters that are flawed and like feel very real. And I think when I say I'm not a character reader, what I'm meaning to say is that I don't have to like a character as a person to like them as a character. I love reading about people and characters that are just so different from who I am, and I know I would never like them as a person and we wouldn't get along, but it's like getting to be in a mind that's so unlike your own. I also really love a character for themes and the conveyance of the author's, like the intent of the thematic content through a character. And for me, even though he is a completely heinous character, my favorite character that I read this year was Kenneth in the Live Ship Trader series by Robin Hobb. He is so interesting to me because he is a character that is like the protagonist of Breaking Bad, where it's like, how far can we go until they are unlikable? How much can you empathize with a character before their heinous acts like cannot balance it out anymore? Like, you can't keep this idea of, oh, well, they had trauma, oh, well, they're doing it for this reason or for that reason. Like, no, they're a bad person. Like, how far can you take that? It's a really interesting concept, which I think is why a lot of people like Breaking Bad. I really enjoyed that part of this. Live Ship Trader series is very thematically focused, in my opinion, and there's focuses on the cycle of trauma, which gets conveyed through him. Another part of what I like about him is like the juxtaposition that he has set up with another male character in these books that I also really dislike as a human. And it's this idea that there was one character that's doing the wrong things for what he thinks are the right reasons, and another character who is doing the right things for the wrong reasons. And this is another place with Kenneth where you get to see, and Robin Hobb does a really good job of like towing this line of how people perceive him based on the parts and the facets of himself that he shows. And you see that with his subordinates, you see that in his relationships with women, you see it in his relationships with non-human characters who can maybe see into him a little bit better. I'm trying to say this in ways that isn't spoilery. And then in relation to younger characters too. He is not a good person. He has a lot of things in him that you can empathize about. He has you get to see him as he presents himself, and then you slowly get to see into his history and see why he is the way he is. And you get to see him consider trying to break those cycles or continue moving on in the trajectory that he already was on. And I loved that. I think a lot of people would disagree with me because he is not a good character, but I really enjoyed reading that. But that is all I got for this video. These are all the books that I enjoyed. I enjoyed a lot more than this, but these are what I'm considering my favorites. So that is all I got. So until next time, happy reading.